And let's get started immediately. So, Colonel Charles McGee, would you please kindly tell us a little bit about your life, your experience, your World War II experiences, and especially then how you experienced this infamous Jim Crow laws? Thank you.
Pleased to respond to that request, and we welcome you to our session this morning. Yesterday we talked about the actual air power performance of the Tuskegee Airmen, but today our subject is more of what did we overcome. And to begin this, we have to go back to 1925, and I'm going to read to you from a report to the Chief of Staff, and the subject is the use of Negro manpower in war. This is dated October 30th, 1925. Under the Constitution, the Negro has the rights of citizenship. He forms a considerable part of the population of the United States. The subject is how Negro manpower would be used in war. This report has under facts bearing on the problem. The Negro is physically qualified for combat duty. However, he is by nature subservient and believes himself to be inferior to the white man. He is most susceptible to the influence of crowd psychology. He cannot control himself in the fear of danger to the extent the white man can. He has not the initiative and resourcefulness of the white man. He is mentally inferior to the white man. It goes on to say that the Negro is a fair laborer, and his participation in World War I in combat was a failure. They forgot to talk to the French.
Yeah.
Political pressure at the time forced them to form two Negro combat units, infantry units. We're here to talk about the aviation experience. Now, this report ends, and I should read this to you. It is recommended that this study be taken as the basic policy of the Department for the use of Negro manpower. And this was policies and plans came from study over a culmination of several years by the faculty and student body of the Army War College. Well, I guess it's good that I can say it's good. A lot of us didn't know about this study and what was being said, because when America was building up its manpower to support our allies in Europe and become a part of it, the Negro American was just as patriotic and willing to serve as any other American. But it took a battle, and in our participation, it's often called about two V's: fighting for victory over Hitlerism in Germany, and the second was fighting over racism here in America. Now, there were those who, and by the way, Congress had some ideas, and there were laws passed relating to draft. That law said that there should be no discrimination based on race, creed, or color. We've added a few other things to that since that time. But that law was on the books, but not being abided by the predominant society all across America. The fight was for participation and equal access and choice of what we would want to do. Well, out of this policy, the War Department's position was, well, it's inimical to good order and discipline for blacks and whites to work together, So we can use our Negro manpower and labor units, but it had to be under white leadership, and certainly we would not mix black and whites in the same units, because we cannot eat and sleep and work and play together. So it had to be separate. That was the policy under which we were fighting for participation. Oh, we had cranial capacity less than white, therefore could not absorb the technology to be involved in a field such as aviation. Blacks can't fly. Later General Davis, but then a West Pointer graduating in 1936 from the Army War College, said, "I'd like to fly." And the Army told him, "You can't fly, we don't have any black units." So he didn't fly. He was aide to his father and professor of air science at Tuskegee Institute, and back to aide for his father. Pressure in 1939 around the country, they built up the Civilian Pilot Corps to increase the pool of pilots available to our service units, all of the services. At first, no, blacks can't fly wasn't included in black colleges. Finally, 5 or 6 black colleges had the civilian pilot training program. Get a license in a small plane, and those desiring to be military pilots going next door to the Army, Air Corps saying, "I want to be Army pilot." The Army said, "Oh, we can't use a black pilot, even though you've learned to fly. We have no black mechanics." Now, those of you who know about that, it's kind of interesting, you know, that black can't fly an airplane by white mechanics, but that was Army policy. Can't use you. Pressure still continued, and it took a lawsuit by one of the graduates of the civilian pilot training program in Washington, as well as the pressure around the country from those believing it should be different, to get the Army Air Corps to say, "Okay, we'll experiment." An experiment. Aviation. We'll authorize one squadron, a pursuit squadron. We'll call it the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Oh, all the fine print and all of the necessary support. All of the necessary support, and I'll say a word about what that is in a moment. Wow. We've got to build an airfield for this program. Blacks and whites can't be together. They found $4 million to start building Tuskegee Army Airfield 9 miles out from Tuskegee, Alabama. Blacks can't fly. One of the laws passed was that the Army, to relieve its experienced officers, could contract the primary phase of Army training to a civilian pilot training school location. Tuskegee Institute had a very successful civilian pilot training program, including moving into the secondary phase of training and other training instructors. Besides just getting a pilot's license, they began to train instructors. They applied and got the Army contract for this experiment. One squadron, folks, is 30 pilots. All of that necessary support, though, is close to 400 other people. All of this, besides the direct support, some 200, and others your engine mechanics and those that maintain and keep the aircraft flying. But this included the medics, it included administration and supply and ordnance, and yes, even the field maintenance required for that unit to go into combat. The training started in 1941, and the instructors that Tuskegee Institute was using in the other black schools that had civilian pilot training programs were black pilots who followed Bessie Coleman's Aero Clubs in the 30s, and there were some 100 black pilots around America, even though the Army was saying that the blacks can't fly. My first instructor in class 43F in the flying program was a black pilot in the PT-17 under that Army contract to have the primary phase of training for this experiment that the Army was taking. Well, the 99th Pursuit Squadron began their training. The mechanics, by the way, were trained at Chanute Field in Rantoul, Illinois. Actually, the 99th was started there because I mentioned the Army policy was got to have black mechanics before we can have black pilots. So the mechanics actually started their training at Chanute Field. As they completed their training, they were shipped south to Maxwell Field in Montgomery, but Tuskegee Army Airfield was still being built. Maxwell would not use those mechanics even though they needed them at the time, but they sat there on the other side of the field under restrictions that are not a part of our subject today, waiting for Tuskegee Army Airfield to open. Well, the 99th pilots began their training in 1941. Those some 30 pilots by the end of the year and into 1942 were complete. They were mated up with their mechanics, and they're combat ready in December of 1943. I'm sorry, 1942. Army had a problem. What white commander is going to take a black unit under theirs? It took them 4 months to finally ship the 99th and all of their necessary support to North Africa, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group. Not at the base of the 33rd, because segregation, America's going to take segregation overseas. They tried to tell the folks over there, be careful how you treat and operate with these folks, because they've got problems. The 99th went to their own base. They did get brand new P-40s to begin their combat, but they had to send an officer over to the 33rd's location, get their briefing, come back to their base, and then go fly their missions. But the command attitude was reflected in the reports by Colonel Momeyer on the 99th's experience. Not aggressive, only shot down one aircraft, should be patrolling Liberia. Well, the Army, in the meantime, realizing that as replacements were needed, continued the training at Tuskegee and authorized additional single-engine fighter pilot training for a fighter squadron. These pilots also trained in the P-40. Now, the 99th proved that blacks could fly the aircraft given the opportunity. They still hadn't been proved their ability in combat. Hearings were going on here in Washington by those who didn't like the idea of blacks moving into the aviation field, but the program continued because of the need and what was going on as the war progressed. I mentioned command attitude of the 33rd Fighter Commander because a little bit later, and by the way, they kept the 99th in combat after those hearings because reports up through Eisenhower's command showed that the 99th accuracy and ability to put bombs on target were just as good as any of the other units over there fighting as we pushed the Germans out of North Africa. We took Pantelleria without the ground forces even having to go there from the bombings into Sicily and out of Sicily into Italy. When the 99th was moved into Italy, they were assigned to the 79th Fighter Group, but this commander's attitude was different. So if there was any first integration, it took place with the 99th flying with the 79th Fighter Group out of Italy. And over the Anzio beachhead in an 8-day time frame, the 99th pilot shot down 17 German aircraft that were trying to defend our advancement. Oh, blacks can fly in combat, again, given the opportunity. But that changed No, it didn't change Army policy then, because behind the 99th came the 332nd Fighter Group, 3 fighter squadrons, combat ready in the P-40, and they said, we're changing your mission to P-39. They still had patrol in mind, and the 332nd Fighter Group was sent directly to Italy. That was the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadrons to perform harbor and coastal patrol from Naples up to the Anzio beachhead. Well, folks, our bombers are now out of North Africa and flying from southern Italy deep into the German-held territories and defenses, and our bomber losses in some cases were running over 50% of a squadron as they tried to destroy Germany's war-making potential. And this goes all the way from the delayed landings in France to the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, so from one end of the European continent to the other. Our bombers needed escort because, you know, when every bomber went down, 10 American lives were possibly lost. They picked 4 fighter groups to form 15. The tactical work that was being done was 12th Air Force. They formed 15th Air Force, picked 4 fighter groups to begin the escort of our B-17s and B-24s. The 332nd Fighter Group was one of those 4 groups picked. And in combat, we gave the P-39s to the Russians that we were flying and picked up the P-47 Thunderbolt, beginning the escort and moving from the Naples area to the Adriatic side of the Italian peninsula. The escort work was for protecting in the high altitude and strategic work of our B-17s and B-24s. The 332nd only had the P-47 for about 2 months, and the famed P-51 Mustang became available there in theater for all of the groups that were doing the escort. And they asked an old fighter pilot why we always emphasize the P-51. It had higher altitude capability, greater speed, and greater range than the other fighters that are available. The others, P-47 was good and did its job, but for the strategic work, and particularly for escorting our B-17s, the P-51 became the old fighter pilot's favorite aircraft. But in this escort work, the 332nd Fighter Group performed some 200 escort missions. We had great leadership in Ben Davis Jr., who even told us, young and race fighter pilots, second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and later some captains, that I'll court-martial the pilot that goes happy hunting. What that means, happy hunting, is that you're escorting some bombers, but you hear that there's some fighters in the air and you're anxious to become an ace, so you leave your bombers, go to try to find one of those fighters to shoot them down. We stayed with the bombers that we were assigned and only left them when they were actually attacked by the Focke-Wulf 190s or the Messerschmitts, and would fight them off if they attacked the bombers that we're escorting. We also, if we had fuel, would assign crews to support the stragglers, aircraft with engines out that had to drop out of their bombing formation. We would stay with them as long as we could. I need, as my time is getting pretty tight here, I want to mention one other part of it. So that experience changed the attitude, not necessarily of our military people, because we were still segregated. Our own base, our whole own operation, and we even had bombers struggling, trying to get back to their base and having to land wherever they could. Some were happy to have a meal and sleep on the cot of somebody away, even though it was a black unit and they found out there was a black operation going on. And there were others who still just felt that wasn't right and would go on and take a cold truck ride as soon as they could get it back to their base rather than participate together. The other portion that I want to talk in this WWII battle very quickly is that even though the Army policy may have continued in the form of being segregated, they added medium bomber training to the Tuskegee program in the mid-1943, a couple of months after I graduated. And the medium bomber training was for the Mitchell B-25, and they had the 477th Bomb Group. Again, in this case, 4 squadrons and all of their necessary support. Training to go to the Pacific. They fought the battle at home because the commander at the base at Tuskegee Army Airfield, so crowded by this time, they were moved up to Indiana and Kentucky for their training, combat training, as pilots graduated and the crews came together. And the base commander, though, wanted to still maintain segregation. Army regulations say that there's an officers club for officers, there's a club for the NCOs, and people use the base facilities. Well, this commander, Colonel Selway, with General Hunter's approval in 1st Air Force, said, I'll write a base regulation and control this. His regulation said, trainees on my base will only use the facilities I authorize. Well, who's in training? 477 Bomb Group to go to the Pacific. He said, your officers cannot use the officers club. The officers decided in 2s and 3s to go to the officers club. 101 were arrested for trying to enter the officers club and not use the building that he had designated for trainees. Investigation, of course, came out of that. That commander was relieved, but the Army Air Corps still had a problem. You've got the 332nd Fighter Group. The war ended in Europe. We hadn't dropped a bomb yet out, but when we did, the unit deployments began to back off shortly after we dropped the bombs there, and the Army Air Corps said, now what do we do? So they formed a composite group and kept 2 of the B-25 squadrons and that 99th, our 1st Pursuit Squadron, but they still said, what do we do now? Godman Field in Kentucky and Freeman Field in Indiana, too small. They moved everybody to Lockburn Air Base in Columbus, Ohio. That was a move, and so if any time you hear somebody say that we had a black Air Force, they're talking about the time that the 477th Composite Group moved and occupied Lockburn Air Base. Well, the United States Air Force became a separate service in 1947. And the Air Force, in their studies, determined or found out 2 things. Number 1, they said we need to use people based on their training and experience and where needed, not the color of their skin or their happenstance of birth. And secondly, we're not getting enough money to maintain Lockburn Air Base on an equal basis. We intend to integrate. Army hadn't integrated. The Air Force said we intend to. A few months later, a very courageous President, Harry Truman, issued 2 executive orders. One had to do with equal hiring throughout the federal government, but the one we're concerned with was 9981, which said all of the services shall integrate. He didn't give a timetable, but he said the buck stops here.
Yeah.
Here's the message. All shall integrate. Now, when the Air Force became a separate service, they had no use at the time for that composite group. So the 332nd Fighter Group was reactivated as a wing base operation there at Lockburn, flying the P-47 aircraft. 3 squadrons now. And what I didn't say was there in Europe in July when we got the P-51 aircraft, the decision then was to assign the 99th to the 332nd Fighter Group also. So standard group, 3 squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. We add the 99th, so even though we weren't wanted, we had the largest fighting group for 15th Air Force from July on through the end of the war. Very late, just before the war ended, they deactivated the 302nd, went back to its standard three squadron group. But what did this accomplish? Even though our society wasn't ready, it proved that we can respect each other, that we can eat, sleep, work, and play together, and that we can, out of our abilities, add to the strength of these United States. In July 1, well, first let me say, the first annual Air Force meet for Top Guns was in May of 1949. A number of years later, the Air Force began publishing a list of the top guns of the Air Force. And in this report, and I think it was in the late 60s, they had 1949 unknown, and then went on from 1950 to name the Top Gun winners. Well, folks, the Top Gun winners in May of 1949 in the reciprocating engine phase were pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group flying the P-47N. But in July 1 of 1949, the Air Force closed Lockburn Air Base, and the Negroes who were still participating in the service were really scattered around the world. Now, the program produced 992 pilots. Some 600 or more were single-engine pilots, and over 400 of those participated in the war of North Africa and Italy, flying out of the Mediterranean theater. There were over 200 medium bomber pilots out of the program, and as I said, all of the necessary support was some 10 to 12,000 people when you look at all of the support for those 8 squadrons. The military led the way, folks, in the early civil rights actions and movement in the country, and I'll close my remarks with that statement. Thank you.
Okay.
May I just add that Colonel McGee is a holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross, and that after the war he continued in the Air Force and had tours in Korea and also in Vietnam. Thank you very much.